Welcome to the Intergovernmental Relations Committee meeting. Today we are all gathering and have some just updates as obviously things are going on both in DC and Raleigh that this time of year we keep our eye close on. And with that, I'll hand it over to Dana to walk us through the agenda.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is Dana Fenton with the City Manager's Office. Mr. Chairman, would you like to do introductions before I get started?
Great point. Thank you very much. Tariq Bakari, Chair, and we'll go around in the room and then online.
Julie Eisel, committee member.
And online.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Matt Newton, committee member.
Ed Driggs, committee member.
And staff, please.
Yes, Dana Fenton with the City Manager's Office.
And Donata Jackson, Office of Constituent Services.
And any staff online.
Rebecca Hefner, Housing and Neighborhood Services.
As well as any support partners that are online.
Nelson Freeman, KTS Strategies.
John Easterling, KTS Strategies.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. Dana, I'll hand it to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today, Mr. Chairman, we have federal and state updates. And then the last item on the agenda is functional consolidation for the co-chairs to take up. Then the first item, the federal update, Mr. Chairman, there have in committee. Overall, the U.S. Congress seems to be working along at this time of the year. It seems like their work is going very slowly. But still, there are some things to report here, and we'll be going over the issues in our legislative agenda and some other strategic issues as well. Next slide, please. Under your first item, infrastructure and community needs, we have 4 different things we want to bring you up to date on: appropriations, the airfield improvement projects, a housing bill called the Lifeline Act, and a bipartisan infrastructure law update. Next slide, please. As we reported last month, the Appropriations Committee House Appropriations Committee is starting to mark up their budget bills. They try to get those out by the end of this month so that they can have floor votes in July. And that's a process that we see every year from them. And as previously reported, I believe that I did previously report that Congresswoman Adams has asked for an earmark, one of our 2 earmark requests for additional funding for cure violence implementation. Next slide, please. I want to give you all a heads up over the next 60 days or so. Staff, that includes the Aviation Department Management, myself and our federal legislative team will be initiating another round of briefings with congressional delegation staff about the airport's pending application for federal funding to construct the airfield improvement projects. And it has to do with the 4th parallel runway and the associated projects. And for those committee members who were on the committee last year, we did have talks with congressional staff back in late June, early July, I believe, just to get the ball rolling then. But now we're at another point where we're going to have another round of meetings. You may be hearing about that from folks who serve us in the U.S. Congress, so I just wanted to make sure you knew about that. And I think we're getting to the point where the Aviation Department will be submitting a request to the Federal Aviation Administration, a formal request for the funding, federal funding for these airfield improvement projects. And we will keep Mayor and Council updated on any new developments having to do with this as they occur over the next 60 days or so. Next slide, please. This slide is about the Lifeline Act, which is a housing bill that was introduced by Congresswoman Adams. And essentially what this would do is to allow state and local governments to use their fiscal recovery funds from the ARPA bill from last year to help with low-income housing tax credit projects. A lot of those projects have loans with maturities extending out 30 or more years. And of course, we have a requirement to expend these dollars, that is the fiscal reserve fund dollars, by December 31 of 2026. And so there's legislation that would clarify that this funding could be used to help with these loans with maturities beyond December 31 of 2026. And we have Rebecca Hefner from the Department of Housing and Neighborhood Services here, in the event any of you have any questions about this. All right, next slide, please. Want to provide you with a update on the bipartisan infrastructure law and what staff is doing to compete for notices of funding opportunities. There are 3 notices of funding opportunities with due dates in July, September, and September. One is for transit-oriented development planning, another is for bridges, and then there's a last one for pedestrian safety, safe streets and roads for all. And we do have about 4 of these grant applications right now into the U.S. Department of Transportation. And we expect to hear announcements on these later this summer. And then there's a grant they're going to be considering for next year's grant cycle. That is the Mega National Infrastructure Project Assistance Program. And you might recall we talked about this at a few meetings. It's called the University City Rail Safety and Street Connectivity Project. We were looking to try to get this into this year's grant cycle. But you have to, in a grant like this, you have to work with the owner of the facility that would be the subject of the grant. In this case, that's North Carolina Highway 49 up near the university, that is owned and maintained by the North Carolina Department of Transportation. And we just, when it gets down to it, we just need to have more time to work with NCDOT to ensure they're comfortable with the project. And so we were unable to make the late May deadline for submittal of the 2022 grant application. But that work continues. Next slide, please. We have some upcoming opportunities. A lot of these are the same as what you saw last month, except that the Reconnecting Community Pilots Program, which was supposed to have a June 2022 release, now says just summer release, and that could be anywhere from tomorrow through about the same time in September. And then we have the others there as well that we're awaiting. And next slide, please. Under the rubric of comprehensive immigration reform, earlier this year, Senator Tillis joined a group of, including one other Republican and 2 Democrats, to look at some areas of immigration that they could agree upon and that could gain 60 votes in the Senate. But because of timing issues with either getting to agreement and coming to agreement on the actual legislative text and the schedule for the U.S. Congress this year, because it's an election year, there just isn't a lot of time to get that done. So it looks like it's probably not going to occur this year. And next slide, please. And there were 2 other strategic issues I wanted to bring up with you. You may have read about the gun safety framework that was agreed upon by 20 U.S. senators, 10 Republican and 10 Democrats, including, it was led by Senator Tillis along with a couple other senators from around the country. And the last I heard, they hadn't agreed on the legislative text, but we've been keeping our eyes open to see what they may be coming up with. And furthermore, another piece of legislation I had brought to your attention earlier, the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act. There are dueling House and Senate versions of the bill that are in the conference committee process. They're still there. I understand it's still going to go on for some time. There's a lot of issues there between the 2 houses that need to be reconciled. And of course, this bill focuses on U.S. competitiveness with China. And the House version of the bill is pretty interesting, and that includes a big chunk of money, $1.2 billion, for historically black colleges and universities to expand research, educational, and innovation capabilities. And next steps on the next slide, please. There's the schedule for the Congress in August. Both the House and Senate will be out for their district and state work periods. And of course, before then, we do expect the House to take some action on those budget bills that are reported out by the Appropriations Committee. And of course, in September 19th, is when the Intergovernmental Relations Committee has its next meeting. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I am finished. I'd be glad to take any questions from the members.
Committee members, any questions on the federal update?
Mr. Chair,
Yes, Mr. Driggs.
so are there any discussions going on anymore about the Build Back Better, I guess it was? I mean, it sounded like Manchin was considering certain ideas, but are we going to see another $1 trillion or so come up because of that?
Well, and I'll let Dana fill in, but my understanding, which may be slightly old, is that Build Back Better is completely dead. And there in its place is the IIR, someone help me, Infrastructure.
Infrastructure
Nelson?
Investment and Jobs Act?
Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, right, of which people in staff roles at state levels for the last probably 2 to 3 months have been having calls, getting insights as to what it looks like. Dana, do you have more intel on that for Mr. Driggs?
Yes, sir, I do. On the Build Back Better, there were talks that began recently between Senate Democrats and Senator Manchin to see whether a much slimmed-down version of Build Back Better could be enacted. That would include a big chunk of money for energy tax credits, and there were a few other things in there, social programs, the child tax care credit that were being talked about as well. And it seems like pretty much everything has gone silent for the last few weeks. There hasn't been much being said about it. So what we don't know is whether negotiations are entering a serious period or whether they have just moved on to other things. But it's, there are a lot of things there that are still up in the air, frankly.
They can't figure out this is a bad time to be committing another $1 trillion. The infrastructure bill, there was an infrastructure bill, 1.1 trillion that passed, right? That's a done deal.
Yes, sir, that's a done deal, yes. And we've been, and again, I think Mr. Bakari was saying is that state and local government staffs from state and local governments have been working hard on that over the last couple of months, looking at these notices of funding opportunities. And I think Mr. Bakari also alluded to, there's been a lot of meetings, webinars, things like that the Department of Transportation and other federal agencies have put on to get the word out there about the programs in it.
Thank you.
Other questions? Okay, if I don't hear any other questions, Dana, we'll let you move on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The next item on the agenda is the state legislative update. And we have several things on here that we'd like to bring up with you. Well, first, we'll go through what the General Assembly is generally doing right now in terms of what their schedule looks like, some of the key session issues, and then we'll take a look at our legislative agenda, along with a bill under the other strategic issues area. And if staff could bring up the state legislative update slide, I'd appreciate that. And you go to slide 3. Anyways, as that slide presentation is brought up, I'll go ahead and start with some of the opening parts of this. The General Assembly, they convened on May 18th. In fact, we had our last IRC meeting 2 days before that. And they've been covering some very key issues this year. They will always cover appropriations in a long or a short session. But look at these other issues they're bringing up: the Medicaid expansion, medical cannabis, sports wagering, and transfer of revenue for transportation. Those are 4 pretty meaty issues that you would normally not find addressed in a short session. And at the same time, today is June 20th. July 1 is a week from this Friday. The leadership still intends to adjourn by July 1. They don't have an appropriations bill approved yet. And these other 4 pieces of legislation up there, under the key issues, have not moved forward as of this point. Next slide, please. Under appropriations, I think we reported last month that the subcommittee chairs, actually we did not report last month because they hadn't even gone into session yet, but the appropriation subcommittee chairs are in the process of, or probably close to, working out their area-specific portions of the budget. The House and Senate leaders agreed on the top-line spending amount, and leadership is targeting next week, the week of June 27th, for votes on the budget. That means something big is going to happen this week, so we're keeping a close eye on that. Next slide, please. Medicaid expansion. This is an issue that the House has said that they don't have the votes to pass, but the Senate went ahead and passed a Medicaid expansion bill by a very, very healthy margin of 44 aye votes to 1 no vote. And it not only includes Medicaid expansion, but it also has provisions related to certificate of need, increase in hospital assessments, and telehealth. Now, the Healthcare Association in North Carolina supports Medicaid expansion, but they've expressed concerns about the other parts of the bill because of the cost to hospitals. And at this point, it's passed the Senate, but the House has not yet scheduled a hearing. So, next slide, please. And just like the previous bill, medical cannabis, which passed earlier this month on a pretty healthy margin, 36 ayes to 7 noes, has not been scheduled by the House for a hearing. So, and this is the one, of course, that allows the use of medical marijuana for specified conditions. Next slide, please. Sports wagering. This is a piece of legislation that passed the Senate last year. It was a closer margin there, but it was reported out of the House Commerce Committee in November of last year. And we've seen press reports that one of the House committees, the House Judiciary 1 Committee, will take up this bill tomorrow. But the last I checked, it had not been formally scheduled for a hearing. And of course, after it goes through Judiciary 1, it would also have to go through the House Finance and House Rules Committee before going to the floor of the House for debate. And one thing that we have read about is that the legislation will have a higher tax or fee on the income that these operators get. Instead of an 8% tax or fee, it would go up to 14%. And that additional increment would be used for the state general fund purposes. And of course, that amendment would have to be put into the bill. And right now, and again, they have not yet scheduled a hearing for the legislation. Next slide, please. Under mobility, the first issue is one that we've talked a little bit about in this committee a couple months ago. There's a recommendation that came from the NC First Commission that Mayor Pro Tem Izelt served on. They had some revenue ideas that they recommended to the General Assembly to help with the lack of funding in the State Highway Trust Fund. And this recommendation would take a portion of the state general fund sales taxes and redirect that to transportation. And this does provide a dedicated, stable, and permanent source of revenue for state transportation projects. That legislation, Senate Bill 793, was introduced, and it could very well, if it does have the favor of the Senate, it could be part of a budget agreement. And I say it could because we don't truly know whether it would actually be part of a budget agreement or not. And when fully implemented, it could bring in about $500 to $600 million per year in more revenues for the State Highway Trust Fund. The second bill on this page.
Dana, and Mr. Chair, if I could ask a question. What has to happen, though, for Senate Bill 793? Has it been in the Appropriations Committee or no?
I can't remember which committee it has been referred to, but it would, normally in a bill process, you have to be reported out of the committees. It would have to, in this case, be debated on the floor of the Senate. And then, once it passes, it would have to undergo that same process in the House. But if it were to be part of the budget agreement that is reached, then it could be voted on. And what we've been hearing about the budget is that they're going to take a conference committee report and put the budget in there. So it could become law without the normal committee process.
Okay, so given the short time frame, is that the most likely path?
That would be the most likely path to get something passed right now, yes.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. The second bill, the equitable distribution of Powell bill funds, this was introduced by our members of our delegation, and this would restore the Powell bill funding for both the cities of Charlotte and Raleigh. As you all recall, that we are now at 2/3 of the level that we received in fiscal year 2020. And the other sponsors of this bill include many members of our delegation, but also many members of the Wake County delegation. And this legislation has not received a hearing, and it, just like the other bill up above, if it were to be funded or were to be restored for the two cities, then it could be part of a budget agreement that's agreed upon by the Senate and House.
Have any Republicans signed on to that, Mr. Fenn?
Not that I recall.
Thank you.
Next slide, please. Going to your infrastructure and community needs, a few things here. You may recall that the North Carolina Airports Association is trying to lay the groundwork for an increase in the Airport Improvement Program funding. And of course, this provides really good funding for commercial airports around the state. There are 10 commercial airports altogether. And we receive anywhere between $25 and $30 million per year. And they are looking at actually trying to do something this year, perhaps with some of the unappropriated federal resources that they have at their disposal. And the same thing for another bill, the funds for the Carolina Aviation Museum. Representative Bradford and Brown put this in at the request of the museum, and they're looking for $10 million to help with their relocated facility. Next slide, please. And there's a strategic issue which I'd like to bring up with you all today. This is a bill that I believe I brought up with committee last May after it passed the House. And since it passed the House last May, actually on May 11th of 2021, it has sat over in the Senate Rules Committee and then was recently re-referred to the Senate Commerce Committee. And the Senate Commerce Committee did report this bill out last week. It has to go to two other Senate committees, but I wanted to talk with you about this before we got too long or too near the end of the session. It's House Bill 91. It's called Commercial Property Plan Review. And essentially what it does, it puts on us an unfunded mandate to provide a higher level of service when it comes to reviewing initial plans and issuing building permits for commercial and multifamily plans. We have to do the initial review within 21 days or within 15 days from the receipt of additional requested information. That is, we need to do that plan review plus issue the permit. And not in all cases, it's not possible to do all these plans within that time frame. Some of the plans are very, very complex. Other times you are just inundated with a lot of different plans. And in fact, the Charlotte Fire Department believes that they would need to expand the staffing in their plan review section by up to 7 positions. And I say up to, I don't mean actually 7, but they're looking at that right now to see just how many they would have to add in. Now, here's the kicker. If the local governments do not review the plans or issue the permits within the specified timeframes, then the applicants can choose a qualified third party or a reviewer from the North Carolina Department of Insurance to review and approve the submitted plans. And in that case, if those plans are approved, then the local governments must issue the permits within 72 hours. And furthermore, the local governments would have to refund or waive the plan review and building permit fees upon the issuance of the building permits by those third-party or marketplace pool reviewers. So we would essentially have to, basically, for the work we've done, we would have to foot the bill for it, fiscally speaking. So again.
Mr. Fenn,
Yes, sir.
quick question on this. What is this replacing? What time frame, or is there no time frame in the current model?
There is no time frame right now in the current model.
Interesting.
And just before I get too much further into this, I know there'll be questions. This legislation came up last year because supposedly there were a few local governments that took an inordinately a long time to get plans reviewed. In one case, it supposedly took 18 months to get a building permit issued. Of course, there's several hundred local governments, including 100 counties and probably about 550 towns and cities. So it certainly was an extraordinary situation, but again, that's why the legislation was filed.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, sir.
So who is behind this? Do we know?
Yeah, the representative is Mr. Zanger. He's from the Winston-Salem area, and he is a freshman representative, and he is a developer by trade. And there's a few other folks on the bill with him, including Representative Brody, who represents Union and Anson counties. And a lot of you know Mr. Brody. He's also a home builder.
I mean, this is a significant intrusion into local authority. Has the league weighed in on this?
Yes, the league is the one statewide organization that is leading the charge against this legislation. Yes, and Aaron Winnia from the league, who you know, Mr. Driggs, has been front and center on this before both the House and the Senate committees.
So can you comment publicly on whether you think it's got legs?
I'm sorry, can you repeat your question, Mr. Driggs?
You comment publicly on whether or not you think it has legs, this thing. I think this is outrageous.
Yes, I do think it has legs, definitely. At the committee meeting last week, a lot of senators expressed agreement with having timeframes of 21 and 15 days. They did not seem to care too much about the impact on local resources. Of course, if this were to pass, then the city council would have the option of raising the plan review fees to fund the difference. And I was provided some data today that, or maybe not the data, but the end result is that if Charlotte Fire, for example, had to hire, say, just one additional plan reviewer, then the plan review fees in the fire department would have to increase by 9.5%. So that is if you chose to take a hypothetical increase in the cost and pass it on to the development community.
But also, Dana, we can talk offline, but if this has the effect of driving some people away, so as you suggested, the revenue base is eroded, this is a process that's meant to fund itself, right? So we have a fee recovery goal in terms of the percent of the cost, and it will absolutely cause the cost to others to go up, the cost of the service by the city to go up. And 21 days is tough. Like we went over this at some length a few years ago, and the plan reviews were taking a month or whatever, which maybe is too long, but trying to achieve reliably this 21-15 timeframe, it's not a minor thing. Like there will be people, if this was enacted, that go elsewhere. We will lose revenue in that function, and we will either then have to cut back on that function or charge everybody else more. Anyway, I didn't know this was happening, but this is bad.
Thank you.
And Mr. Fenton, I think the takeaway here, because I don't want to jump to a conclusion on this yet. I wasn't following this. I'm just looking at it at face value right now. I know that I have for a long time wanted us to get more serious about removing red tape and headwinds and timing from our permitting. So I think as we learn more about this and see if it has legs, for you to continue in the diligence and the data gathering you're doing is obviously the right path. But specifically gathering us over the last couple of years, micro and macro views of what our permitting process and building code kind of plan review process looks like. What are the average times, the median times, longest, shortest? What are the factors that make those different? Where are the funnel points? Because regardless, I think this is a great opportunity with a flashlight on this issue right now for us, no matter what happens there, to get better ourselves. But we certainly want to understand where we are in relation to this benchmark that's set. And I think you're on that way, understanding what the costs are. But I would just ask you to add what our current kind of SLAs are, if you will. What is our delivery time, and when the service level agreements that we would set, like today, what would those look like? Does that make sense?
Mr. Chair, if I could just say, 2115 is very tough. That cuts into, in other words, it's not just a penalty for excess time. It would take a chunk of ordinary activity away. And the difficulty they have in that department is if there are fluctuations in the plan submittal activity and you can't adjust your staff, then during peak periods, you might have longer wait times, and then suddenly you find all this stuff is being diverted. It really messes up the economics of that function. So at a minimum, as I say, I'd like to see a bigger allowance before this provision kicks in.
Yeah, and totally agree. I'm not making any pre kind of accepted notions of 2115 numbers itself. I just think we've looked at this in the past in depth. Let's look at it again with this lens on it and see where we are today and what those choke points are, because we may need to move in response to this, but we also may have an opportunity to get better ourselves.
Yeah.
Do we know roughly what the average time is right now for us?
I don't have that data with me right now, and I'll be glad to contact the fire department and Charlotte Water about this. Those are the two departments that are being impacted by this legislation.
Yeah, I think that is the absolute needed course of action for us next.
Yeah. And Mr. Chairman and committee, if it's okay with you all, what I do plan on doing this week is talking with our delegation about this legislation, particularly our state senators, and to let them know that this is something that could raise our cost. It could potentially raise fees if it were to go through. And of course, we're always looking to see how we can do better, but certainly trying to keep it within 2115 framework could prove to be pretty costly. So just wanted to give them the update that we're looking at this, and it could be very costly.
I would just request that you make sure you talk to Bradford.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'll try to do that. Okay. All right, next slide, please. And next steps, they're still targeting, of course, a week from Friday for adjournment for the short session, and September 19th is the next IRC meeting. So, Mr. Chairman, that's all I have, and I'll hand it back to you in case there's any further questions.
Yeah, I'll open it up for questions after one comment by myself, or actually question. Dana, are you familiar with any defined strategy or process, or really just what's going on in relation to the mayor's decision to join that initiative to put $750,000 worth of ads into the Raleigh market for requesting voters to reach out and express support for light rail and transit and TMN related funding and support? Because I wasn't aware that there was that was going to be happening, and I have already gotten some material feedback that that's not being well received. I'm just curious, do we have a line of sight from a staff and governance perspective as to why that's happening, or is that something that just wasn't on your radar either?
No, this is not something that the city was involved in. This was understand it was a mayor's campaign issue.
Okay, understand. I think we need to be a little more coordinated and thoughtful in how we go about these things, because that was probably 750,000 of wasted money in the Raleigh market, and it may actually be a net negative towards our ultimate efforts for this.
Well, Mr. Chair, we know it was funded by that outside group. Mr. Fenton, when you say campaign, do you mean political campaign?
Political campaign, yes, sir.
So, yeah, I think the difficulty is that it looks like a statement qua leader of the city and not qua candidate. And certainly I was surprised by it. So, okay.
Any other final comments or questions from the committee on the state update?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chair.
Yes, please.
Dana, the NCDOT told us some time ago that they were about 50% over budget on their capital plan, their 10-year plan, and they had convened a group to discuss that and come back in the summer sometime with basically a new alignment. So do we know what the status of that is? Are we expecting to hear something about what projects will move ahead?
Mr. Triggs, great question. I have not actually been following that, but I'd be glad to contact CARTPO to see what they can tell me about it and report back to the committee.
Yeah, if you could just let me know. I mean, there are some projects there that could get postponed to Never Never Land, and we need to know what they are as we do our rezoning and other planning. Thank you.
I'll just say that in CARPO, we have not we haven't had that discussion in terms of which projects would in fact have to be value engineered or eliminated or moved. I did miss, Mr. Eggleston attended the May meeting, but I did not hear that there was any conversation along those lines.
But you do remember, Mayor Pro Tem, what we were told, right? That there was this group, a working group of some kind, and that they were going to try to realign the projects with the funding capacity.
Right.
And my assumption is that certain projects are going to get canceled or postponed as a result.
Right. And I think people are still waiting to hear on that. Now, there was a lot more revenue this year, and maybe it's because they're waiting to hear on the state bill regarding moving funding over from the general fund. But I don't believe there's been any additional activity in terms of making any decisions on what would get funded and what wouldn't.
As I recall, the shortfall was something like 10 billion, so it would take quite a big windfall to make up for that. Okay, thank you.
Other questions, comments? Okay. And then Dana, is there just that last item on the agenda?
Yes, sir. The last item is the functional consolidation item. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'll give that update. It's really not much of an update. If you will recall Co-Chair Winston's update from the last strategic session, we've had a lot of really positive progress in communications. We met together with their IRC board on the county side, but the county kind of shuts down part of their normal process over the summer, their committees. So we are just kind of watching and waiting until September when they bring that work back up. So you're not going to really hear any material updates on that, we would expect for now. So right now, I think you've gotten a good update, everyone. Clearly, there's a week and a half, almost 2 weeks of insane activity going on in the General Assembly right now, more so than I've seen in a short session in a very, very long time. So things are moving lightning fast up there. Let's keep each other updated when we see little things, because there's going to be a lot of movement, and where we can pounce and make sure that we are advocating for and championing things that make sense for Charlotte, we should, and it will be happening on a very quick basis. So with that, Mr. Fenton, I will ask if you have anything else to say, and if not, we can close out.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I just received a email notice from the House Judiciary 1 Committee that Senate Bill 688, the sports wagering bill, will be heard tomorrow, sometime 10 minutes after session, which could mean any time of the day. So, but I would expect something to be talked about in committee tomorrow. I'll be glad to update you all if you like.
I bet you that's going to be interesting.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Did you like my pun? That was a pun. Excellent. Okay, everyone, it's a zoning night. Let's get out of here before, and rest before our eyes before that brutal experience every month. Motion to adjourn.
Second.
So moved. Second.
Let's roll.
All in favor? Hang up.
Thank you, committee, and see you in September.